Shannon's Lumber Industry Update.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. It's episode 147. Today, I'm going to be featuring a species often called Parota, sometimes called Guanacaste. We're going to talk about U.S. federal forests being opened, or really reopened, for logging. I want to talk about a tree that actually thrives on lightening and answer some questions about some fungus that shows up in logs. It's probably indicative that you didn't saw it into boards fast enough. And we want to talk about how do we know that we're choosing the right species of wood for what we planned on building. Welcome back to the show, everybody. I'm your host, Shannon Rogers, your resident wood nerd, and I just want to say thanks for tuning in. Thank you for sending in the questions. I had some great questions over the last couple of weeks. In fact, one of the questions inspired the species we'll be featuring today, Parota. So keep those questions coming. You can go to lumberupdate.com. There's a form there you can use to fill out your questions. You can also DM me on Instagram at lumberupdateshow, or just send me an email, lumberupdate@gmail.com, and that will get your questions into the queue, certainly. Also, thank you to everyone who continues to support the show. This is a featured species episode, so all of my Patreon supporters at the walnut tier are getting a copy of this Parota sticker mailed out to them. Patreon.com/lumberupdate if you want to be one of the cool kids and support the show. But I wanted to jump into news stories. I kind of talked a little bit about the tariffs in the last couple of episodes, and it's still such an emerging trend. It's hard to say really what's happening. But one of the other things that's going on with the current administration is this idea that if we're going to put tariffs on more inbound lumber and encourage more domestic lumber to fulfill construction needs, we need to make sure that we've got the material available. And there are a lot of federal forests, mostly west of the Mississippi. There's a little bit down south, some in the Great Lakes region, some in the Appalachians, but mostly we're talking about the western states. If you're watching the video, you can see a map. All the blue areas here are U.S. federal forests that are going to have additional acreage open for logging. So I'm of two minds of this. You've heard me speak in the past about how our infrastructure has to be dramatically improved in order for us to be able to even have a chance of meeting the demand on lumber. But here's the other thing. Construction lumber, in large part, doesn't really come from the U.S. Now, southern yellow pine is certainly a valid group of species that can make 2x6s and 2x4s, etc., but it can't fulfill all those needs. Southern yellow pine also has other uses, like flooring. It can also be used, certainly pressure-treated lumber is all southern yellow pine, but it also can be used in some finer kind of appearance grade type work. It has a great deal of uses. So really, that's what we're talking about. As we move up into the western states and we move into the ponderosa and the lodgepole pine area, that all gets grouped into the southern yellow pine. You remember my episode on pines, it's all part of that yellow pine group. But that's still not really sufficient to meet our needs. And when you're thinking about all of the Douglas fir and the hemlock, basically the spruce pine fir, hem fir type stuff, all that stuff is coming from Canada. So if we're not going to be bringing it down from Canada due to tariffs, southern yellow pine has to shoulder that burden. So yes, there are a lot of U.S. federal forests that frankly probably should be better logged just from a forest fire prevention. Remember my episode on healthy forests where we just talked about, the risk of forest fires and all of the stress that's put on these trees that are allowing beetle kill, but also allowing forest fires to happen. This could very well be a good thing, but there's a couple of things here. First, the infrastructure still needs to be improved. So if we're cutting down more trees, but we don't have enough sawmills, we don't have enough people downstream of, frankly, the lumberjacks, we can't turn those logs into boards to feed the construction economy. that could be a bit of a problem. Certainly, we could throw some money at that. We could repurpose some plants. We could, and many large construction timber plants are, heeding the call, and they're bolstering their facilities. They're adding on. There's been some resurrection of some plants down in the southern states of the U.S., but I still think there's a long way to go to bolster that infrastructure. And one has to ask, do we start cutting down more trees only for those logs to sit around waiting for sawmills to be built? Or do we build the sawmills and then have the sawmills sit around waiting for the logs? It seems like we could probably get the logs to the sawmills a little bit faster, but that is a scary proposition too. If you've got sawmills sitting idle, desperate for logs, suddenly the felling practices might become a little bit more desperate, a little bit more driven by got to get the logs, and proper silviculture may not be followed. So in the grander scale of things, we're trying to catch up. We're trying to build an industry that really hasn't been a booming industry since when we did things very poorly. When you look at the poor logging practices and poor forestry practices of the late 1800s, that was really kind of the last time that timber was in such demand. And if we quickly go back to that demand and try to shoulder it all in the United States, I wonder, will people be more desperate? Which brings me to my other point. If we start opening up lands for logging, what kind of regulation is in place? And the article that I've got up on my screen talks about how, here's a direct quote from the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins. We can manage our forests to better provide domestic timber supply, create jobs and prosperity, reduce wildfire disasters, improve fish and wildlife habitats, and decrease cost of construction and energy. Well, okay, that sounds nice. But then the Forest Service responded with an agency statement that said, in alignment with the Secretary's direction, we will streamline forest management efforts, reduce burdensome regulations, and grow partnerships to support economic growth and sustainability. Now, the middle of that statement terrifies me. Reduced burdensome regulations. Well, when I compare U.S. forestry and getting a log to a board to like a retail lumber rack, I compare that to like Brazilian or Paraguayan or African forestry and the regulations and chain of custody that tracks log to board to port city to, import port. None of that exists in the U.S. So what burdensome regulations are we talking about? Now, there's certainly logging in federal lands is prohibited, and you can't really get in there and start cutting things down. But once the tree is felled, there are no checkpoints from California to Utah or Utah to Georgia. You can move lumber across this country without any kind of checkpoints or any kind of regulation whatsoever. So if we quickly start felling trees in federal lands without any kind of regulation in place, how do we keep it in check? How do we make sure that we don't repeat the improper harvesting of the late 1800s? Now, we may see some more coming out of this, and ideally we've learned from the past. I'm having a hard time saying that with a straight face. Ideally, we've learned from the past, and there won't be this like gold rush to pull lumber out. Ideally, the agencies that manage the federal lands now, manage in air quotes, basically manage keeping people out, will play a more active role in what is being logged. And is it being logged in order to achieve a healthy forest first and, material resources second? There's a lot of things that could go wrong here. I just feel like there's so many little bits and pieces that aren't in place yet, and we have to be a little cautious of that. But speaking of healthy forests, this is interesting to me. This is one of those stories that kind of fell by the wayside. Nobody was talking about it at all. Andrew actually sent this to me. So in Michigan, let me pull up this story. So back in April of 2025, there was a pretty big ice storm that hit Michigan, and it wiped out huge tracts of red pine in Upper Peninsula of Michigan as well as the Upper Mitten of Michigan. Literally just snapped the tops right off of these red pine trees. If you're watching the video, there's just standing trunks with no canopies whatsoever forever and ever and ever in Michigan. I'm trying to find if they have an estimate on the total. It's a lot, basically, but a bunch of ice came in, weighed down the tops, and they just snapped off. So you've got these dead standing trees, and it's starting to look a lot like the West beetle kill pine. This is now the biggest concern they have. You've got all these dead trees just standing there, and the beetles, which again, the pine beetle is not an invasive species. It's a native species. And the dinner bell is ringing. And as things warm up in Michigan, those beetles are going to descend on this pine and basically render it useless. So there is a concerted effort to get together to try to get out and actually log all these dead trees, not only to prevent fire, but to get ahead of those beetles and maybe be able to turn it into some usable lumber. The problem is it would be marked as salvaged lumber, which is going to net, if you're lucky, half the price of regular growth, regular harvest lumber. So there's a lot of cost to go in and actually take these trees down with very little return on this. So a lot of this is like pro bono work that these people are going out into the forest just to take it down, so to maybe recoup something. But it's just particularly interesting that there's been no mention whatsoever of this. I knew nothing about this story. And this is, as we're talking about additional logging and managing our lands, there's a huge amount of trees that were just completely wiped out. Now, we've seen similar things in Georgia with Hurricane Helene. Crap, I'm mixing up my hurricanes. I think it was Helene. Same type of thing that happened down there in Asheville, North Carolina, and Georgia. Huge stands of trees that are now, gone because of storms. Moving on to something a little bit different here. John Shapansky sent this to me. Actually, several people sent this to me, but there's a study going on in Panama that particular tree, the Dipteryx oleifera, and you know what? I haven't looked that up to find out what the common name is. Dipteryx, isn't that the mosquito genus? Something like that. Anyway, this tree actually thrives on lightning strike. So they've been studying lightning on the forest and what it might actually do, and kind of stumbled across the fact that lightning actually helps this tree to survive, because the lightning strike hits the tree and it basically fries all of the parasites in the tree, all the parasitic vines, things like that on the tree, and reduces the competition for the tree. The tree is able to basically absorb the electricity and dissipate it, killing everything around it and basically ringing the dinner bell for the tree to continue to thrive. This is, I don't know if we'd call this evolution, but it's pretty dang cool. That there is this tree that's like, yeah, bring on the lightning. I'm going to do a heck of a lot better. It's quite a few people who've actually sent me this story. And NPR did a little segment on it that you can actually listen to. And there's a YouTube video on here as well that you could check out if you're interested. But anyway, I will link to this in the show notes. I think it's particularly cool. The studies they did to how they actually showed that the lightning allowed the tree to prosper. But more importantly, what do you do? Just sitting around and hoping that lightning will hit that particular tree. So they actually put lightning rods and things in the tree to attract the lightning to the tree, and still showed that the tree was doing extraordinarily well with it. I just think this is very cool. And thanks to everybody who actually sent me this story to talk about our lightning thriving tree, if that's the word we're looking for. Okay, let's move on to our featured species, Parota, or Guanacaste. That is Enterolobium cyclocarpum. That's one that I had to really look at my notes to make sure I'm saying that right. Enterolobium cyclocarpum. This is out of Costa Rica. In fact, it's the national tree of Costa Rica, sometimes known as the elephant ear tree. But Guanacaste is probably where you see it mostly outside of the U.S. Parota is what it tends to be called inside the U.S. I've seen it interchangeable. It is a big reddish tree with a creamy sapwood. And I do mean a big tree. And that's really what this is known for more than anything else. Huge, giant slabs for conference tables and things like that. The tree can get up to 110 feet tall, and average diameter 5 to 8 feet. And they can get up to 10 and 12 feet in diameter. What's interesting about this tree is a lot of these big tropical trees tend to have buttresses and they spread out at the bottom. And if you're watching the video, you see these two slabs and you see there's a little bit of spreading, but really not that much. The Parota tree does not have buttresses, so it is able to be harvested pretty much all the way down to the ground in a somewhat uniform nature, and it allows you to through saw and end up with kind of uniform rectangular-ish boards, unlike those kind of difficult to work with unwieldy buttress trees that can be hard to saw. Sometimes they won't actually fit on the saw carriage itself. The Parota is just a big log all the way down to the ground, whereas a lot of times you'll see these uniform logs, and that can be 6 feet up off the ground. This is literally cut all the way down to the ground. The other thing about Parota is, for the most part, don't quote me on this. I don't know if it's 100%, but it's pretty close to 100% FSC. It's coming out of FSC forests. Costa Rica is pretty amazing with their forestry department. They do some pretty amazing things. Certainly, it's a smaller country, so they're able to manage their forests because of just smaller acreage. But I believe almost all of the Costa Rican forests are FSC certified as far as logging purposes. But it also, as the tree gets older, they tend to fall over. They tend to kind of hollow from the inside out, and they become unstable and they fall over on their own. So a lot of harvesting of the Parota tree is actually just picking up logs that have already fallen. There's not any cutting going on. It's just salvaging more than anything else. So sustainability is kind of at the key of this tree. And certainly the red kind of stripy, interlocky kind of grain with very, very little sapwood. Those watching the video, there's a typical Parota slab. If you were to Google Parota lumber, you're going to find 1,000 images like this, where it's like all heartwood. You know, if you're looking at a 5-foot wide slab with like an inch of creamy sapwood on either side of things. It's pretty typical of tropical trees. They don't need a lot of sapwood because the food, the water is in such abundance in a rainforest. From a technical perspective, what's interesting, this is a tropical species, but it is not like other tropical species, and the fact that it's quite soft. Janka hardness is 470. So similar to a lot of pines, certainly harder than something like Western red cedar, a little bit softer than something like cypress, but compared to some of our common domestics like cherry and walnut, which can be 900, Parota is quite soft. And I actually got a question from Jacob on Guanacaste. He says, my father-in-law just gave me 4 slabs that are 4 foot wide by 9.5 feet long and 2 inches thick of Guanacaste that a friend of his had imported. This is not locally available in Idaho. No, it is not. I did some digging. Janka is 440, which is quite soft, as cherry is 600. Cherry is 900. There may be some cherry that's 600. I don't know. I've reviewed some of its other properties. Seems like an interesting wood, and the color is certainly nice, but wondering about its thoughts, your thoughts on its best use. A table seems perfect for such a size slab, but the softness makes me hesitate. It will get dinged very easily. Other cool things to hear about it would be cool. So I kind of had this species in my queue for a featured species, and that email came out, and I just kind of pushed it to the top. So yeah, I do listen when you guys say, hey, feature this species. So we kind of talked about this, whether it was last episode or a couple episodes ago. 400, 500, yeah, it's pretty soft, but that doesn't mean you can't use it for a table. Certainly you can use certain finishes, rock hard polyurethanes, tabletop finishes, even epoxy finishes. Now, to be careful, epoxy finishes get a little plasticky looking. That will add that durability to a tabletop. But 400 is not that soft. And yes, it maybe possibly could be dinged, but I guess you have to ask yourself, what are you using this table for? If you're letting your kids, play on it, yeah, that's one thing. If it's a dining table, may not be that big of a deal. certainly a hard finish will help preserve a lot of that. I don't think it's something that should prohibit you from, using it, when it's a large piece like this for a table. But let's also think, just because it's a large slab doesn't mean you have to keep it as a large slab. My buddy Matt actually did a lesson, I think it was at Woodworking America last year, on how you can build furniture from slabs and get the best grain and color match just by slicing up that slab. There's nothing wrong with taking a big slab of lumber and slicing it into little drawer parts and rails and stiles and things like that. Take advantage of it. Certainly, Parota lives in the slab market, which is going to be a somewhat inflated price point. Slabs are still considered kind of like figured lumber. They're unique, and you can put whatever price point you want on it. Don't try to break it down by the board foot price to say, oh my God, it's $20 a board foot. You're buying it by the slab. But, in this case, the Jacob, what did he say? He's got 8-quarter material that's 9.5 feet long, and it's 4 feet wide. It's a lot of material to play with. So, I've seen Parota slabs for $1,200, $1,800, sometimes in the 2000s. You can do a lot with that type of real estate of lumber to play with. But in essence, it's kind of soft, but at the same time, it's a diffuse porous tree. What makes it soft is that the pores that are there are pretty large, but they are solitary pores. So there's a lot of meat in between. The parenchyma, they're vasocentric parenchyma and medium-sized rays. So that in and of itself adds to the density of the material in between the pores, and that vasocentric parenchyma around the pores is going to add a fair bit of density right around that pore. But because you have relatively large pores, that's what's really knocking down the density. The density is 0.34. So you're about 500ths to a full tenth less than a lot of other tropical woods. And it's because of those large pores. But the material in between that is going to be much, much denser. And that's very typical. You can expect with medium rays. Rays are always going to be quite a bit denser in those vasocentric parenchyma. So don't let that 470 number really throw you off. Again, that's taking the entire face value, literally the value of the face as you're driving that steel ball in, and it's averaged over multiple tests. I think you're going to find some Parota that is going to be harder than others. But the other reason that makes it rather soft is it's a very fast growing tree. And this is one of the other things that makes it kind of a sustainable rainforest option, because it is replenishing quite readily. It's also what makes it a sustainable harvest tree. As it's falling over, there are younger trees taking its place and growing up very quickly, so the turn rate is quite a bit higher. So as you can expect, it's often sold in slab form for tabletops and furniture making, but like a lot of things, it's also used for pallets. There's a lot of material that's cut away from the log that can be used for pallets. What's interesting to me is a lot of the Parota slabs that you see aren't just from the trunk. They're often from the limbs themselves. The tree branches pretty quickly and it gets really, really fat, sometimes even 5-foot diameter branches. So you can get slabs out of the branches themselves. Now, you do have to be a little cautious when you have branch wood. You may have some tension built up into it because of the way the branches are actually, being pulled down by gravity. But when you've got something that large, that big around, it's got enough internal structure that I don't think you're going to have too much tension built up in it. It's just interesting. I don't know that you could look at a slab and say, oh, that's from the trunk or that's from the branch, assuming that it had been squared off. If it's a live edge slab, you might be able to tell a little bit more that it was from a branch, but it's kind of interesting that more of this tree is actually harvested on lumber than most instances. Usually they lop off all the branches and just deal with the trunk, whereas Parota is using much more of the tree. What I found interesting, though, is this is used a lot in boat building, and it actually makes a lot of sense due to the incredibly large size, but also the lower density, the lightweight nature of it. It's a great boat building material. While it is a diffuse porous wood, those larger pores and the lower density does mean that you can bend it relatively easily into bow shapes, boat type shapes, which you don't normally think of when you think of tropical woods. So this is a tropical tree, certainly coming from Costa Rica. It's, Costa Rican cloud forest, tropical rainforest, all that stuff. But this acts a lot more like a temperate climate softwood. This is not a softwood. It is a hardwood, certainly. From an alternative species wise, if you're looking for aesthetics and appearance, it's very close to sapele. It's got a little bit more going on in the grain and kind of busyness of the grain that reminds me a little bit of koa. It's certainly redder than koa, but somewhat interesting there. Could compare it to mahogany. In fact, there's a lot of genuine mahogany coming out of Costa Rica and Central America for that matter. The hardness is certainly softer genuine mahogany, but the workability of it, at least in my experience, the workability has been quite agreeable. Despite the kind of stripy nature that you're seeing, like in some of the images that I'm flashing onto the screen here, it's not super interlocked and quite easy to work with. So I could actually very quickly see why I would compare that to genuine mahogany. Certainly from a softness perspective, from a color perspective, you could compare it to redwood. I think you'll find redwood will be a little bit more figured than Parota, but certainly from a workability and size, yeah, a lot of similarities between the two. It's just an interesting species where a market has been found for it in slab form. You're not really going to find it sawn into dimensional lumber or 6 to 8 inch wide lumber. It's pretty much coming as slabs because it is so easy to harvest it without those buttresses, and because it's falling over out of its own accord. Through saw it is probably the best way to deal with it and export it from there. Being that it's coming from Central America, the distance is not nearly as far. It can land on a boat and go a short hop across the Gulf of Mexico and be into Texas ports and into the US. So it's a relatively affordable species, and you actually can find it in most lumber yards around the 50 states. I'd be curious to see how long before a lot of these lumber yards start importing slabs and sawing it into lumber and stocking their shelves with 6 to 8 inch wide lumber, because I do feel that the slab market is kind of sort of dying off a little bit. So yeah, I think if you haven't had an opportunity to try out Parota, just do a quick Google and you're going to find it in most of the lumber yards that you're going to frequent anyway. So I do want to say thanks to Jacob for bringing it up. It's a cool species. I don't have a lot of experience working with it. I've turned some stuff out of small blanks, and I built a couple of boxes out of an offcut piece of a slab that we had at the lumber yard. So there's your featured species for the month. Again, Patreon supporters at the walnut tier will be getting this handy dandy Parota sticker that you can stick to your forehead. You can put it on your bumper. You can stick it on a wall, or you can buy a piece of Parota, stick it to it, and put it on a bookshelf as your own wood reference library. Let's move on to a couple of questions here. All right. Zach wrote in and said, I recently saw this red oak, and I was looking forward to getting some 8/4 by 12 by 12 foot boards from it. This log was dropped off from a tree service years ago, maybe decades ago, to a different sawmill's property. He has retired and had posted the logs up for free, and that's where I got this one. So there's zero history on where it came from, but very likely nearby to Green Bay, Wisconsin. The 3 logs prior to this one from his yard were completely rotten, punky through and through, so my expectations were low when I started on this one. I've been trying to find online what causes this green looking color without a whole lot of luck. I've seen small instances of this color in the past when splitting oak firewood, but nothing to the extent that this log has. So for those who aren't watching the video, I've got 2 boards sawn here, and they are gnarly in the middle, very punky in the middle, but also just this very distinct green hue to them throughout. Zach goes on to say, the closest I found to a culprit is the green elf cup fungi. The stuff seems to affect many different types of wood. Every sample I see is mostly definitely blue-green in color, but not the green of this log. So what I wanted to do is kind of look a little bit deeper at this. And I responded to Zach and said, it could very well be, maybe the elf cup fungi. But here's the thing. If you were able to collect some of that wood and ship it off to a lab to positively identify what is the fungus responsible here, you probably wouldn't get a definitive answer. You would probably get an answer 4 or 5 different fungi that could be involved here. Usually you'll probably get somebody, shrugging their shoulders and go, I don't know, this is very typical, because this is very typical. If we pay attention to his story about the fact that these logs had been sitting around for a while and they were given away for free, and the first couple were kind of punky through and through, that tells me that these logs have been around a very long time. Now, I've done an episode in the past about how a log will actually keep for a while, but you have to saw it. For a while is kind of generic though. Decades, 4 or 5 years, unless you've ponded that log and submerged it in water, it's gonna have growth in it. And the fungus is sparked on by oxygen, which is why if you pond a log, you're gonna limit the oxygen to the log and you can keep them for decades, maybe decades. But if the logs are just left in the yard and nothing has been done to try to seal them up or put some sort of borax solution to keep bugs away, even then, oxygen is going to get to this material and the fungus is going to start to eat it. Also, if these trees were felled during the spring and summer when the sap was rising, there's the dinner bell as well. And the fungus are going to go nuts, gobbling up all that sugar that's now just sitting there in the log instead of being consumed by the tree itself. So, long story short, if you fell a tree and you leave it in log form for a long period of time, it's going to start staining due to fungus pretty quickly. Certain species, like red oak, are going to be more prone to it than others, but just about every species is going to have some sort of fungus. We talked about this in the extreme with holly a couple episodes ago, where if you don't fell the tree, saw it into boards, and put it in the kiln like in the same day, you're going to get staining. And a lot of that is just because holly is so white and you can see the stain so readily. Some darker woods, you may have more time. It doesn't mean that the staining's not there. You just can't see it through the darkness of the natural occurring color of the wood itself. This log, however, you can see how it's really torn out in the middle and it's starting to rot on the ends of both boards. And the fungus continues all the way through the board. Ultimately, what's happening is the fungus, it's expanding exponentially. It starts to grab hold somewhere, either through a wound in the wood or just, there was an excess pocket of sugars that attracted the fungus. It started growing there. Well, then the fungus begins to multiply and multiply and multiply, and very quickly it gets out of control. Once you start to see rot, or as he describes, punky sections, it's over. Now you're dealing with full on structural loss in the tree itself. Staining, mineral staining tends to be kind of dark gray. Fungal staining is going to be blue. It's going to be green. Beetle kill pine is the blue color is actually from the fungus that grabs hold due to the wounds and the stress that the beetles put on the trees. The beetles don't cause the staining. It's the fungus that comes from the beetles weakening the trees. Here, you've just got a red oak log that has started to stain, and whatever caused the green color could be any number of things. It could be the type of fungus, it could be the soil chemistry in which the tree grew, it could be the particular temperature and humidity with which that log sat in for a while that caused it to go that particular color. The long parts at the top of this image that just have this stain are probably still okay, but the parts at the bottom where you can see that full-on rot, it's not really worth doing anything. You can stabilize with epoxy all day long. It's just probably not a good idea to use this for any kind of structural purpose. The point is, regardless of what that fungus is, this is very typical. This will happen to really any tree, most non-exterior trees. This will happen if you don't take some measure to prevent, to saw that log that's been sitting around for a while. This is also why we fell our trees in the fall and the winter, because there's not as much stuff for the fungus to grab hold of and eat, and you've got a little bit more time for that log to sit around. If you know that you're not going to be able to saw the log for a while and it's been felled in the summer, you're going to want to submerge that in a pond as quickly as possible to prevent the oxygen from allowing fungal growth to happen. So yeah, if you really want to know what fungus that is, grab a sample of it and send it off to a lab, but they're probably going to say there are 17 different funguses on this log right now and a bunch of other bacteria and things that you may not want to know about. I guess the moral of the story here is Don't let your logs sit around too long without taking some sort of precautions to prevent them from rotting. And certainly, if you don't know the provenance and how long that log has been a log, you never know what you're going to get when you saw it open. And you might just be sawing really, really expensive firewood, frankly. All right, moving on to a question from Vaughn. And this is actually in response to my call for newbie dumb questions. And I think this is funny because while he writes in saying, this might be one of those new questions, I actually think that it demonstrates a fair level of knowledge and a good lumber update listener. So he says, how do you tell if some species you've never heard of is suitable for what you want to do? Long version. I wanted to build some small 6 to 10 inch grain wrapped decorative boxes using the resaw trick. So I headed up to a real lumber yard to find some wood that, quote, looked pretty. I got to the yard, found all the common domestic hardwoods I was expecting, plus a bunch of other woods I'd never heard of. Some looked really nice, but I had no idea if they would be reasonable for me to resaw and work. Was it too hard, too soft, too fragile, too something else I wasn't thinking about? Would it resaw nicely? Would it take a finish okay? So I'm pulling up the wood database on my phone and searching. Being a good lumber update listener, I know to look for Janka hardness, so I get that number. Of course, the number doesn't mean anything to me in isolation. So I pull up cherry and compare. Okay, softer than cherry. I look up pine. Okay, harder than pine. So it's between cherry and pine. A little soft, but that can't be too bad, right? By the way, he ended up buying some black limba. So the picture in the video that I'm showing is the actual piece of black limba that he bought. He goes on to say, moduli. Yeah, I remember Shannon talking about those. Are the moduli to look about the same as cherry? Can't be too bad, right? Time to pretend I know what I'm doing and carry this board confidently up to the counter. So how should I have evaluated this piece of black limba that I've never heard of, given my specific goal of a small decorative box? What did I not think about? See attached photo for what I bought. I haven't had a chance to work it yet. So I think it's funny. He asked this question and in many ways kind of answered his question and writing it out. So kudos, Vaughn, for listening to the show and putting into practice what I talk about. The numbers don't really mean anything in isolation. There's no question. But when you compare it to species that you have heard of, you can learn a fair bit. And Janka hardness is really the first thing that I will always focus on. And cherry and pine do tend to be my kind of benchmarks. I often use white oak and maple as benchmarks as well, 12, 1400 respectively. So you can really get an idea domestically what we're really talking about. So limba, black limba, white limba, it has a hardness of 670. So it is softer than cherry, but not that much softer. Now the modulus of rupture, elastic modulus, those are important to know if you plan to span a larger distance. So the stiffness is going to be important. If you plan to bend it at all, your bending strength is going to be important. And that's where elastic modulus and modulus of rupture, MOR, MOE, are important. In your case, you're building a box. Neither one of those is relevant, so you don't really have to pay attention to it. Ultimately, what you're looking for is the kind of density numbers and the hardness numbers. They're often going to run hand in hand. I do like density because sometimes the Janka hardness can be a little misleading. Parota, our featured species, is a good example of that. It has a very low hardness number, but when you work Parota, you'll find that it doesn't feel as soft as the Janka number says, and that's because of the density number. It's because of those solitary wide open pores that's throwing that density off. But it really should be a lot lower density than the number actually indicates. And that's because the stuff in between the pores is quite a bit meatier and quite a bit harder. So you can look at a Janka hardness, and if you're like, okay, that's not acceptable, that's really, really soft, look at the density and see what that number tells you. If that number is a little bit higher, you might find that it works like a wood that has a higher Janka number. It's kind of like those rheophil temperatures. The temperature is 65 degrees, but with the wind chill, it's 30 degrees. Wow, that's a pretty heavy duty wind. But it's that same type of thing. The density can sometimes fool you into thinking that Janka hardness is a little bit different. Those are really the numbers that I look at more than anything. But ultimately, you have to figure out what it is you're going to build. In this case, you're building a small box. So structural numbers mean nothing. A decorative box is not going to get a lot of wear and tear. B, a box of any kind is probably not very big, so you're not going to have long runs if you need to worry about stiffness or bending or really any structural properties whatsoever. You're not sitting on this, you're not sleeping on this, you're not standing on it. It's a box that sits on something else. So structural numbers really mean nothing. But I've also gone on to say that in most instances, when we're building furniture, the technical properties of wood are way stronger than anything we're actually going to need. So we can get away with a lot. So if you're resawing things, I'm going to look at hardness a fair bit. I'm going to look at density a fair bit. I'm also going to look at the porous structure. Is it diffuse, semi-ring porous, or ring porous? Those things will tell me how relatively easy it will be to rip. Are there any lines that the board is going to want to follow naturally, aka ring porous lines, where it could potentially split on me? Those woods will resaw a little bit easier, frankly. The same, but you also may find that it'd be quicker and faster to just split them rather than resawing them. It all depends on what you plan to do with that offcut. In this case, he's resawing in order to make a grain wrapping box, so he's going to need both sides of that resaw. I would actually prefer a diffuse porous wood there that's going to be less prone to splitting. A lower density wood and a lower Janko hardness wood is going to resaw really well. At the same time, what's the biggest issue with resawing? Resawing exposes a lot of fresh moisture. It also releases a lot of tension, and you're going to see a lot of cupping and warping that happens when resawing. With a larger poured, lower density wood, you've got more dead air for that wood to kind of relax into. It's like a buffer zone preventing the wood from cupping dramatically. So that could be a very good thing with resawing. Density, again, plays a major component in how much will it move, or how much buffer zone, how much wiggle room do I have for this wood to move around as I'm releasing all that moisture and tension from resawing. But in the end, Janko hardness and density are the two that I focus on more than anything else, and I just compare it to the other woods that I know of. So if I find the hardness number, I'll find a wood that has a similar hardness that I have experience with. Then I will compare the end-grain structure. Is, ring porous, whatever. Then I look at the pores themselves. How are the pore sizes in comparison to that species that I already know? If you've got a similar pore structure, you're going to find that the whole thing works very similarly to the wood you already know of. And that includes things like shearing strength and how well does it plane. This is the number you're not going to find very readily. Oftentimes it's not even shown on the wood database, but that's a direct reflection of that pore structure. So in the end, it's really just Janko hardness and density numbers. But again, you have to have a frame of reference. Just knowing what the number is and comparing it to another species, if you haven't worked that species and have some kind of firsthand experiential knowledge of how that works, it won't really help you out. So in the end, Vaughn, I think you did a really good job. I personally have worked with black limba. It is a great species. In fact, I probably should feature that in the future. It's one of those ones that doesn't get a lot of play. Frankly, probably because it's coming from West Africa, where there's the major commercial species like sapele and all the mahogany knockoffs are kind of ruling the day. The limba kind of often just stays in country. And when it is exported, it's exported as an afterthought. Maybe due to its kind of unique color, we might see more of that. That's a species that I definitely think I will feature in the coming future. So I think that's probably enough of me yammering on for another episode. I do want to thank everybody for writing in, sending questions. I want to thank Patreon supporters for supporting the show. You're going to get your fancy stickers. They're coming soon. Send in some more questions. Also, heck, I've gotten some great suggestions for species to feature in the future. So by all means, send those in as well. lumberupdate@gmail.com. Until next time, folks, thanks for watching the show. Thanks for listening to the show, and go buy some lumber.